Have you ever wondered what stands guard on the edges of creation, where light thins into shadow and silence listens to first lie? What voice answers the old arrogance that rises in every age, whispering, "I will ascend"? Who meets that whisper with a name that is not boast but thunder? Michael, who is like God? Welcome to the Sacred Chronicle. If you are new here, subscribe now and tap the like button, so this journey through the oldest battles and the holiest mysteries can continue to reach those who seek them. In the beginning, not the beginning of God, who is no dawn, but the beginning of all that sings and burns, there was a harmony that needed no conductor. The high courts of heaven were vast as thought, radiant as praise. Thrones and dominions moved like constellations of living fire. From the heights, hymns descended in currents, and the breath of those songs became the weather of paradise. There were no shadows there in those first moments, only gradations of glory, as if light itself were learning how to rejoice. Among the 7 great princes who stood nearest the throne, one bore a name that was a question: Michael, who is like God? It was not a title comparison, but a standard set against every seed of rebellion. Michael's radiance was not the cold brightness of a star seen from an empty plain. It was the warm authority of a sunrise that rouses a sleeping world. His countenance was calm, his stance unbending, the quiet of a mountain before the storm, and the storm when the mountain speaks. Around him gathered companies of angels whose obedience was not servility, but love sharpened into purpose. The blade at his side was a memory of justice given form. When it moved, the air rang as if struck by a bell too pure for human oar. Yet even in that perfect order, there came a fissure, so small at first it passed like a hairline crack along a vase whose shape had seemed immortal. Among the morning stars was one whose beauty dazzled like polished brass, a bearer of music that braided whole rivers of praise. He was called Lightbringer, and his path was garlanded with admiration. It is a subtle catastrophe when a gaze meant to ascend is bent back upon itself. Reflection becomes appetite. He felt the weight of his own shining, and mistook it for a crown. He listened to the echo of his name in the galleries of heaven, and thought it an oracle. "Why should we bow?" he hissed, but the hiss came dressed in velvet. "Why should we serve when we are glorious? Have we not fire enough within our own names to kindle thrones?" Some angels tightened their ranks at this, and some felt a tremor of curiosity, like a draft sliding under a door. He went on, his voice the gentlest poison. "What is devotion if not the recognition of greatness? And greatness, do you not see it?" His hand touched his chest, and the gesture seemed almost a prayer. It was then that Michael stepped forward. He did not blaze like a challenge thrown across a field at noon. He stood as if to hold the center, not for himself but for the design he served. His words did not swell, they cut. "Who is like God?" he said, and the syllables were a hammer falling on crystal. The courtyard stilled. Even the obedient felt the question cleave their inward parts, exposing love from pride, humility from glittering hunger. "You are creature," Michael continued, voice low as thunder heard from far mountains. "We are creatures, all of us flames borrowed from the fire. We cannot feed with our own breath. There is no throne to steal. There is only the throne, and it is mercy that we are not vapor before it." The fissure widened. The Lightbringer's smile held. "Creature, yes," he answered, soft as rain, "but not common. I have walked the cornices of the emerald sea. I have carried songs that bent the horizon. I have tasted the joy of being looked upon. If he looks, if he delights, then what I am is worthy. Worthiness deserves altitude." He lifted his hands as if to measure an invisible crown. Then came the shiver through the ranks, the turning of a third of heaven like a field of wheat caught by a contrary wind. The faithful cried out without words and moved to encircle the throne, not as defenders, for the throne requires none, but as witnesses of the vow they had never spoken aloud until that hour. You could feel the gravity shift. What had been a single radiant order trembled as brightness in one quarter became a momentum of decline. There are battles that begin with drums, with standards, and with cries. This one began with a question and an answer, and from that exchange the universe learned what war was. They call it the war in heaven, but it is unlike any war told in the Chronicles of Kings. Imagine strokes of fire that carve meanings through air and meanings that collide with other meanings until fabric of existence rings like struck metal. Imagine companies of angels wheeling, not in chaos, but in a choreography learned from the artist who drew galaxies with fingertip. Michael's sword left a seam of singing in the heavens. Wherever its edge passed, pride broke and flared away like slag from the bloom of a furnace. Around him moved Raphael, swift as consolation, Gabriel, bearing news even in battle, Uriel, heavy as prophecy. The traitors swarmed in constellations of fury. Their brightness gone brittle, their harmonies soured to dissonance. Michael and the Lightbringer met at the axis of the world above worlds. There are no words fit for that collision. The blow of Michael's blade was not heat, but holiness. The parry of the rebel was not courage, but self-worship hardened to diamond. Yield, Michael said, not taunt but truth, and for a breath the air wavered as if undecided. The rebel smiled that perfect smile. To whom? He said, as if asking the most innocent thing. To the one, Michael answered, and the name he did not speak shook the pillars. They fought as two meanings of existence at cross purposes, one that descends to lift, one that climbs to own. Sparks from their conflict struck the emptiness and became stars. Currents of power poured from the clash and sloped down the vast distances toward realms not yet open, as if history were being seeded with a memory of this hour. At last, the line broke. The rebel's wings twisted under weight he had never believed real. The truth of dependency. Michael pressed him back, and with a cry that was music torn to shreds, the Lightbringer fell. Those who followed him fell as if a rope binding them to his will had been cut, and their descent plowed the lower regions, making caverns where none had been, furnaces where cold had reigned. Silence gathered after the war in a way heaven had never known it. Solemn, almost severe, as a cathedral empties after liturgy and the incense still hangs in the light. The faithful took up their stations with a gravity that was not fear, but remembrance. Michael stood, sword sheathed, not exultant, not weary. Angels do not tire as men do. They attend. The songs rose again, but an undertone had entered them, an understanding that love must choose, that glory can cast a shadow if one tries to stand before it instead within it. From that hour, Michael's mantle deepened. He was no longer only captain. He became sentinel. Around him gathered those whose obedience had ripened into a kind of ready tenderness, soldiers of purity who could move like lightning and guard like mountains. His vigilance turned outward, beyond the high courts, toward creation about to unfurl, toward places where time would unspool like a river, where creatures of dust would be asked to carry souls like lamps through tempests none of the angels had ever felt upon their skin. It was whispered among the ranks, not as rumor but as contemplation, that the throne would plant a garden, that he would walk in it, that something in that walking would draw the ancient envy like a blade from its sheath. Michael listened, not with suspicion, for suspicion has no place in the upper air, but with the attention of a guardian listening for the first footfall of night. He beheld the cooling of the newborn earth, the mounting of mountains and the muscling of seas. He listened to the stones learn their names and the rivers decide their beds. He watched morning separate from evening and count their meetings. There is a sweetness in first things that even angels savor. But Michael's eyes were drawn forward, to a pair of forms lifted from dust and kissed with breath. Their ribs latticed with wonder, their faces clean with innocence. He saw in them not merely mortality but vocation, the likeness they carried like a flame in a clay lamp. He saw, too, how envy would smell that flame as a wolf smells blood. There are moments in heaven when foreknowledge is like lightning that shows the landscape of a storm before the storm arrives. Michael perceived the serpent's patience winding itself through the groves of the garden as a darker patience wound itself beneath history. He did not descend then, for the commandment of heaven are not impatience but order. He understood that the tale would not be a single battle but campaign across the ages, a war fought in whispers around cradles and in cries on hilltops, in deserts where prophets starve and in palaces where kings forget why they were crowned. The rebels who fell did not fall into silence. They organized a counter for the order they had betrayed, a grim parody where each servant became a tyrant over those beneath, where praise was demanded and never given, and where the setter held only because fear is a glue that hardens everything it touches. Their general, stripped of the name that had once been music, clothed himself in injuries and spite. He learned the uses of shadows, how a truth misaligned becomes a snare, how a desire untethered becomes a hook. He came to understand that man will be most easily conquered not by terror, but by reflection turned inward, by the ancient addiction to self. "I will ascend" was his gospel, and every age would translate into new idioms: power, appetite, technique, fame, each a staircase that ends in air. Against this throb of malice, Michael set his watch. He bore no suspicion of the children of dust. He bore compassion sharpened by the memory of heaven's war. He understood how fragile a lamp is in a wind and how precious its flame. When the word spoke promises over the future, promises of blessing, of a people chosen not for privilege but for service, of a king who would come meek and armed only with obedience, Michael felt the shape of his vocation tighten like a bowstring. The protection he would offer would not be the blunt shelter that keeps the world soft. It would be the shield that permits courage to grow. At times he stood at the margin of human sight, bright as an idea that arrives when despair has emptied the cup. At times he moved like a rumor that sets a tyrant trembling for no reason he can name. He learned to stoop, to take on dimensions that would not break the minds of those who glimpsed him, to speak through dreams that found men at the hour when they are truest because they are most helpless. And always, beneath command and mission, his name worked like yeast through the centuries. Who is like God? A question that humbles kings and comforts shepherds, that exposes idols and steadies frightened brides, that turns the hearts of warriors before they lift their hands. There's a story told among the elders of the angels, not written in the books of men, but remembered in the high places, of a night when Michael walked the outer edge of the created cosmos, where stars thin into nothing and the dark carries no echo. He stood there, not as a sentry against invasion, for nothing lies beyond the all, but as a witness to truth that everything that is gift. He unsheathed his sword and set its tip gently against the void. It did not flare. It hummed, and the hum was consent. The blade seemed to say, "I am not sharpened for pride, but for love. Not to conquer, but to keep." And the void, if the void can answer, was quiet. When dawn came upon the first city of men, stone on stone, smoke threading the air, songs rough with new hope, Michael watched. He did not envy their earthbound feet or their endings. He admired the courage to begin. He knew that the old adversary would bend their beginnings toward ruin, that envy would stalk ceilings as well as gardens, that the cry, "I will ascend," would echo from ziggurats, from towers, from palaces and parliaments not yet named. He also knew that the question in his name would answer each boast at the appointed time, sometimes with a whisper in a single heart, sometimes with judgment that thunders over empires. Thus the stage was set, heaven tempered by war, earth bright with promise and shadowed with risk, an enemy cast down yet cunning, a captain sworn to guard without suffocating, to fight without replacing the freedom he protected. The chronicles of men were opening. The ink of time was wet. Somewhere a prophet would soon be born. Somewhere a king would soon forget justice. Somewhere a shepherd boy would lift his head at the sound of wings. And among those wings, steady as law and fierce as mercy, moved Michael, the archangel whose name is an answer disguised as a question, the commander whose victories leave no ashes, only room for praise to rise. The garden was still young when the shadow came. It was a place where the air itself seemed to sing, where every leaf bore the memory of its maker's touch. Rivers, clear as crystal, threaded through meadows whose grasses swayed in a rhythm older than the moon. The soil was rich with the promise of harvest yet unborn. And in the center of all, a tree rose higher than the rest, its roots drinking from depths the eye could not follow. Adam and Eve walked there as children in their father's estate, clothed in the innocence of unbroken trust. The breath of God still lingered in their lungs, the sound of his voice still warm in their ears. There was no fear between them, no shame, no hunger unfulfilled. They named the creatures of the earth as one names friends, and the creatures answered without dread. But Michael knew that such a peace would not go unchallenged. He had seen the fall of the morning star. He had watched the bitterness of exile ferment into malice. He had felt the cold focus of the adversary, who now moved in silence beneath the canopy of heaven's newest creation. The enemy did not approach in his true form, for that shape bore the marks of ruin. He came instead clothed in the cunning of the serpent, a vessel of elegance, its scales catching the garden light like moving jewels. Through it the voice of the rebel would speak, not with the roar of open defiance, but with the softness of suggestion. Has God truly said? The words slipped like water into the ears of the woman. Not accusation, not command, just a question. Yet it carried the venom of all that had been lost in heaven. Michael was there unseen. He stood at the threshold between realms, the weight of his sword resting lightly in his hand. His orders were not to interfere. Not yet. This was a proving ground, a place where trust itself would be tested. Heaven does not guard against choice. It guards a freedom in which choice is made. And so Michael watched, his gaze steady, as the old strategy unfolded, twisting the truth just enough to loosen its grip. The woman's eyes turned toward the tree, toward the fruit that gleamed like captured sunlight. The serpent's voice coiled around her thoughts, painting visions of wisdom, of power, of a life unshackled by obedience. Adam stood beside her, silent. In that silence, the thread of trust frayed. The bite was small, almost delicate, but the sound of it seemed to echo beyond the garden walls, into the courts of heaven, where the song faltered. In that moment, innocence fractured, eyes opened, but to shame, not to glory. The ground beneath them felt different, as if the very earth recoiled. Then came the voice, not thunder this time, but sorrow. The one who had walked with them now called out, not in ignorance, but in grief, "Where are you?" And the answer came, wrapped in the fig leaves of fear. "We hid, because we were naked." Michael's hand tightened on his sword. He had seen rebellion born in pride. Now he saw it clothed in guilt. The adversary's victory was not total. No victory could ever be total against the will of the Creator, but it was enough to alter the course of human history. The gates of the garden would close. The path to the tree of life would be barred. And it would be Michael who stood there, sentinel of a promise deferred. He descended then, no longer unseen. His presence was like the sudden gleam of a storm-lit horizon. In his hand the sword burned, not with the red of earthly flame, but with a light that seemed to consume shadow itself. Adam and Eve could not look upon him for long. He did not speak to them, for his words were not for mortals that day. His command was to guard, and the command was absolute. As the first man and woman stepped beyond the garden's edge, their faces drawn with a grief they could not yet name, Michael took his place at the eastern gate. The sword moved in his grasp as if alive, turning this way and that, a perpetual fire that would not tire. No hand uninvited would reach the tree of life. No shadow would cross that threshold again. Yet Michael's watch was not only a defense. It was also of waiting. He knew the story was not over. He had heard the promise spoken in the midst of the curse, that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. This was no small thing. In those words lay the map of the coming ages, a thread of redemption that would weave through battles, through covenants, through blood and fire, until it met its fulfillment. Time began to flow as it does for men, marked by birth and death, by the rise and fall of days. Michael moved through that time like a wind unseen, touching the edges of human history. He watched Cain raise his hand against Abel, the first fratricide staining the earth. He stood guard over Noah as the floodwaters lifted the ark above the drowned world. He walked beside Abraham under the starlit sky, when the covenant was sworn. Always, the adversary sought to corrupt, to bend the promise toward ruin. Always, Michael was there to oppose, though not always in a form men could name. Sometimes his presence was the sudden courage of a shepherd before a giant. Sometimes it was a fear that fell on a king who had set his eyes against the people of God. The earth had become the battlefield the heavens had once been. But here, the stakes were not thrones, they were souls. And for those souls, Michael would stand, as he had from the first, unyielding before the shadows. Long after the gates of Eden closed behind the first man and woman, the earth had filled with the noise of kingdoms. Cities rose along riverbanks and fell into dust. Towers scraped at the sky, and then were left to crumble under ivy and sand. But through the shifting empires, through the thrones that glittered and vanished, there moved a quieter thread. A people not chosen for their strength, nor for the splendor of their palaces, but for a covenant sealed by the breath of God. From the moment Abraham stood beneath the canopy of a night and heard the promise, "I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars," the adversary's gaze fixed on them. If the seed of redemption was to come through this line, then to sever that line would be to wound the heart of the divine plan. And so the old war, born in heaven, rooted itself in the soil of Canaan, Egypt, and Babylon. Michael's charge is clear: to guard the covenant bearers, not as a nursemaid shield a child from every harm, but as a commander watches over soldiers whose victory lies beyond their understanding. His interventions would be rare but decisive, for heaven's pattern is not to overwhelm human freedom, but to defend the space in which it can grow. In Egypt, centuries after Joseph had saved the land from famine, his people had multiplied into a nation, and that nation had been shackled. The whips of Pharaoh's overseers cracked over their backs. Their cries rose to heaven like smoke from an unending fire. When the time came for deliverance, it was not Michael who appeared before Pharaoh. That was the work of Moses, armed with signs and the word of the Lord. But Michael was there nonetheless. He was the unseen dread in the courts of Egypt, the sudden faltering of the soldier's courage when he reached for a Hebrew child, the night watch that passed without a single guard daring to enter the homes marked by lamb's blood. And when the waters of the sea rose like walls on either side, Michael stood in the midst, unseen by the fleeing slaves, his sword drawn against the chariots that thundered behind them. Generations later, when the Israelites had entered the land promised to their fathers, the old enemy turned his face toward corruption from within. Idolatry crept into the courts of kings. The songs of Zion began to share the air with the chants of foreign gods. Prophets were mocked, their warnings drowned in feasts and in drunken boasts. But the covenant held, not by the will of the people alone, but because guardians like Michael moved in the shadows, disrupting the plans of those who would erase the name of the Lord from the earth. One of the most ancient tales, preserved not in the canon but in the echoes of tradition, speaks of Michael standing upon the walls of Jerusalem when the armies of Assyria encamped against it. The city was cornered, its gates closed, its wells rationed. The voice of the enemy rang in the streets. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. Has any god of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? That night, the prayer of the king rose like incense, and in the deep hours before dawn, Michael descended. The angelic host moved without sound. Their swords were like threads of lightning, their faces set as the stars are set in the firmament. When morning came, the Assyrian camp was still, eerily still. 185,000 soldiers lay silent, their weapons scattered in the dust. The city awoke to a world remade in a single night. But Michael's guardianship was not only over cities and armies. It was over individuals whose faith was the seedbed of the covenant's future. In the days of the Babylonian exile, when Daniel, the prophet of dreams, sought the meaning of the visions shown to him, it was Michael who stood as his ally in the unseen struggle. The book of Daniel records the words of another messenger to the prophet. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. These were not princes of flesh and blood, but the spiritual realms, powers and dominions set over nations, some loyal to the Most High, others twisted into servants of the adversary. In those 3 weeks of delay, the battlefield was not a plain of dust, but the expanse between heaven and earth, where messengers carrying the decrees of God had to pass through enemy territory. Michael's intervention was swift and absolute. The way was cleared, and Daniel received the revelation. It is in Daniel's vision, too, that Michael is given a title unlike any other. Michael, the great prince who stands for your people. Not merely a warrior, not merely a messenger, but a prince, one whose authority is bound not to his own name, but to the people he defends. This title would echo through centuries of interpretation, painting Michael as a commander whose battlefield is every place where the covenant is threatened. Tradition holds that Michael's defense was not always in battle. Sometimes he came as a guide to the lost, as in the apocryphal tales where he appears to lead the righteous through valleys of death, keeping them safe from the snares of wandering spirits. Other times he stood as an accuser against the accuser, as when the prophet Zechariah beheld the high priest Joshua clothed in filthy garments, while Satan stood at his right hand to oppose him. Though the text names the angel of the Lord, many voices in the early church saw and that defended the figure of Michael, rebuking the adversary with words that burn even in their restraint. The Lord rebuke you. Through famine and siege, through exile and return, Michael's presence threaded itself through the history of Israel, like a line of fire too fine for most eyes to see. The covenant endured not because its bearers were flawless. Far from it, but because it was guarded by one who had seen the throne, one who knew the cost of rebellion and the value of the promise. When the prophet spoke of a coming Messiah, Michael's vigilance sharpened. For the enemy who had tried to corrupt the first covenant would not rest when the new one began to unfold. And as the fullness of time approached, the stage would shift once again. From the court of kings and the fields of battle to a humble village, a young woman, and a child whose birth would shake both earth and heaven. There are titles in heaven that no angel bears lightly. Among them, one stands apart, not for its grandeur, but for its weight. The great prince who stands for your people. These words, spoken to the prophet Daniel in the twilight of Babylon's reign, are not flattery. They are a commission sealed in eternity, a mantle worn only by one who has stood in the courts of the Almighty and heard the decree with his own ears. That one is Michael. Daniel was old when the vision came. His hair had turned the color of desert dust. His body bore the weariness of years spent in a foreign land. Yet his mind was sharper than the edge of any sword, honed by decades of prayer and by the discipline of man who had navigated the intrigues of empires without bowing to their gods. He had seen kings rise and fall, Nebuchadnezzar in his glory and in his madness, Belshazzar weighed and found wanting, Darius preserving the life of a prophet in the lion's den. But what came to Daniel in that final vision was unlike any royal spectacle he had witnessed. It began with fasting, 3 weeks of mourning, of eating no choice food, of touching no perfume or oil. He stood by the great river Tigris when the air thickened, and a figure appeared clothed in linen, his waist girded with gold of Uphaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches. The voice that spoke was not of earth. It was like the roar of a multitude. Daniel fell trembling, his strength drained, his lips unable to form a word. The messenger spoke of a conflict hidden from the eyes of men, a struggle not of armies but of princes, rulers of the unseen, each aligned with or against the will of the Creator. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, the angel said, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. The words drew back the veil for just a moment, revealing a world where the fate of nations was not decided solely in royal courts or on battlefields, but in the clash of spiritual powers contending in realms above. This was Michael's domain, not to meddle in the petty ambitions of kings, but to safeguard the covenant's course against the tides of darkness. Persia had its prince, Babylon had its prince, and so too would Greece, Rome, and every empire yet to come. But over Israel stood Michael, not as an overseer to dictate their choices, but as a shield to ensure they could choose at all. The vision did not end with the immediate conflict. The messenger spoke of wars yet to come, of kingdoms rising and falling in a sequence as precise as it was terrible. He described a final time of distress, such as has not been from the beginning of nations until this time. And in that hour, he said, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands for the children of your people. These were not idle words. To stand up in the language of heaven is to take the field, to move from watchful readiness into decisive action. Daniel's vision swelled beyond his own lifetime, into an age when the covenant people would face both persecution and deliverance. Michael's role in those days was not symbolic. It was warfare of the most real kind, fought on a battleground where no mortal weapon could prevail. While men and women endured the heat of earthly trial, Michael and his hosts would contend with the architects of that trial in the heavens, breaking their lines, dismantling their orders, scattering their designs. Early traditions outside the canon deepen the portrait of this guardianship. In sum, Michael is the one who teaches the prophets to read the signs of their visions, ensuring they are not misled by counterfeit revelations. In others, he is the angel who records the names of the righteous in the book of life during times of persecution, sealing them against the hour of judgment. Even the rabbis, whose words weighed heavily before being set in writing, spoke of Michael as Israel's advocate before the throne, countering every accusation with the evidence of covenant faithfulness. The church fathers would later seize on Daniel's words, seeing in them the outline of a cosmic protector whose duties had not ceased with the close of the Hebrew scriptures. Origen wrote of Michael as the Angelus Maximus, the chief over all the angels appointed to nations, while Hippolytus saw in the warrior who would guard the church as once he had guarded Israel. For the people of God were now one flock under one shepherd. But Daniel's prophecy also carried a darker undercurrent. The final vision spoke of a time, times, and half a time, of a king who would exalt himself above every god and speak blasphemies against the God of gods. The identity of this king has been argued through centuries, some seeing Antiochus Epiphanes, others a shadow of the Antichrist to come. Yet in every interpretation, the pattern remains. The enemy seeks to enthrone himself where only the Most High should reign, and Michael rises to contest him. In apocalyptic literature, the battle is never just about the armies on the ground. It is about the spirits that drive them. When the Seleucid armies defiled the temple, when Rome carried its eagles into the holy city, these were more than political acts. They were the echo of that first rebellion in heaven, replayed in stone and blood. And each time, though not always seen, Michael stood in opposition, ensuring that the covenant's light was never wholly extinguished. There is an ancient tale, whispered in both Jewish and Christian apocrypha, of Michael confronting the spirit that sought to claim the body of Moses. The adversary came not in open battle, but with accusation. The lawgiver is mine. He struck the rock. He broke faith. He is unworthy of the promise. But Michael did not argue the case point by point. He simply said, "The Lord rebuke you." In those words lay all the authority of heaven. For Michael's strength was never his own. It was the strength of the one whose name he bore as a question and as a challenge. Daniel's vision closed with a promise that shimmered like a star in the night. "At that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book." It was not the absence of trial that marked this deliverance, but survival through it, a survival made possible by the standing of the great prince. Centuries later, in the last book of the New Testament, the name of Michael would again resound, in a vision given to another exile on another shore. There too he would stand, sword drawn, against the old serpent. But that day, the war would not be to delay the enemy, nor to shield the faithful for another generation. That day would be for the final casting down. Between the last echo of the prophets and the first cry of the Messiah, there stretched a silence. For centuries passed with no word from heaven to the ears of Israel. No burning bush, no thunder on Sinai, no visions to rouse the kings or warn the nations. It was a silence that could be mistaken for absence. Yet in the courts of the Most High, the war had not ceased. The sword still moved, though often in ways unseen by men. This was the era the scholars call intertestamental, when empires rose and fell in waves over the land of promise. Persia gave way to Greece. Greece splintered into kingdoms that fought over Judea like wolves over prey. The Seleucids came with their statues and their decrees, demanding that the people abandon the covenant and join the worship of gods made of stone and ambition. The altar of the Lord was profaned, its sacred courts defiled by foreign rites. It was here, in the shadows of history's silence, that Michael's vigilance sharpened. Though his name is not spoken in the records of the Maccabean revolt, the stories breathe of him. When Mattathias struck down the king's emissary in the village of Modian, it was more than a farmer's rage. It was the answering blow of heaven against a power that sought to erase the name. When Judas Maccabeus rallied his small army against forces that outnumbered them many times over, his men spoke of visions. Warriors clothed in white riding beside them, a host of brightness moving faster than the wind. One text tells of 5 men descending from heaven with golden armor, leading the charge and throwing the enemy into confusion. Among them, the leader bore a presence no mortal could match, his voice cutting through the din like a trumpet. Many have said this was Michael himself, striking in the hidden half of the battle. But Michael's sword in this age was not always drawn for war. Often, it was a blade that defended the faithful in a realm where flesh and blood cannot enter, the realm of the dead. In the Book of Enoch, a work treasured in the early centuries though not bound into the canon, Michael appears as one of the 4 great archangels who stand before the throne. His task is not only to lead the armies, but to act as a defender of the righteous souls, protecting them from the powers that roam the lower realms. When the Watchers, fallen angels who had taken mortal women and begotten giants, brought corruption to the earth, it was Michael who was sent to bind them for judgment, casting them into the depths until the day appointed. His authority over the rebellious hosts was not by his own might, but by the command of the Lord. Yet he carried it out with a precision that left no room for their schemes. These apocryphal accounts, whether history in the strictest sense or visions layered in symbol, reveal the same truth. Michael's guardianship did not sleep during the long silence. In every generation, he was the appointed prince, ensuring that the covenant line remained unbroken, that the promise spoken in Eden still had a people through whom could be fulfilled. Some rabbinic traditions speak of Michael as the Kohen Gadol, the high priest of the heavenly sanctuary, offering the souls of the righteous as incense before the throne. In this image, he stands not in armor but in robes, not wielding the sword in battle but lifting prayers as a shield against the accusations of the adversary. To the early Jewish mind, this was no contradiction. The same prince who defends in war also ministers in peace, for both acts serve the same end, the preservation of the people for whom he stands. One ancient story, preserved in fragments, tells of a night when a band of faithful priests fled Jerusalem to hide the Ark of the Covenant before the city fell to Babylon. As they carried it under the cover of darkness, pursued by soldiers and by those who sought to profit from its loss, a figure appeared in the pass ahead, a warrior clothed in light, with a sword that blazed yet did not burn the hands that touched it. The priests did not know his name, but their hearts knew they were safe. By morning, the ark had vanished into a place no enemy could reach. Some say Michael still guards it, waiting for the hour when it will be revealed again. Even in the absence of prophetic voices, visions came to certain souls, dreams of a figure robed in fire, speaking comfort in words they could not recall upon waking. In the tales of the desert ascetics of later centuries, it is said that Michael would appear to strengthen them against the assaults of spirits that sought to break their solitude. The accounts differ in detail, but the heart is the same. The silence between the testaments was not empty. It was a silence patrolled by the watchful prince, his sword ready for the moment when the next chapter of salvation history would begin. When at last the silence broke, it did not shatter with the clangor of war or the decree of a king. It was a whisper in a small town of Galilee, to a young woman whose heart was open to the impossible. Another archangel, Gabriel, was sent to speak the words, but Michael was not absent from that hour. In the unseen realm, he stood guard over the messenger and the message, over the woman and the life that would take form in her womb. The enemy would not stand idle. The old serpent had not forgotten the prophecy that the seed of the woman would crush his head. Already he stirred the mind of a tyrant to seek the child's life before he had even drawn breath. The sword in the silence was now a sword in the shadow of Bethlehem, in the flight to Egypt, in the return to Nazareth. And Michael knew, as all heaven knew, that the final confrontation between the child and the serpent would be unlike any battle yet fought. But until that day, his place was the same as it had been since the gates of Eden closed, standing for the people of God, holding the line against the darkness, the edge of his sword reflecting the first light of the dawn to come. John was an old man when the vision came, exiled on the rocky isle of Patmos, with the sea pounding its eternal him against the cliffs. He lived far from the noise of the cities and the politics of emperors. Yet in that solitude, he was drawn into the center of a reality more vivid than the sunlit world around him. "I was in the Spirit," he wrote, "and heaven opened before his eyes." What John saw was not a quiet paradise, but a battlefield. The light of the throne blazed at the heart of all things, and around it unfolded a story that reached back to the first rebellion and forward to the final day. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceived the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. The words carry the weight of both history and prophecy. In John's vision, the war is at once a memory of that first cosmic conflict and a glimpse of its last and greatest echo. The dragon is no longer merely the serpent of Eden. He is revealed in his full, monstrous form, 7 heads, 10 horns, crowned with blasphemous names, his tail sweeping a third of the stars from the sky. This is the enemy as he truly is, stripped of all disguise, naked in his rage against God and his creation. Michael stands at the forefront, his armor gleaming not with ornament, but with the burnished proof of battles fought since before the first dawn. Around him gather the hosts of heaven, their number beyond counting, each one burning with the same unwavering loyalty. The clash that follows is no mere exchange of blows. It is a collision of truth and deception, of fidelity and rebellion. The dragon's roars shake the heavens, but they are met by the unyielding cry of Michael's command. In John's vision, the outcome is decisive. The dragon is hurled down, his defeat absolute in the heavenly realm. No longer can he accuse the brethren before the throne, For the accuser's place in heaven is gone forever, but his fall is not into oblivion. It is into the earth. And here's the great mystery and the great terror. Cast down, the enemy does not relent. He rages all the more, knowing that his time is short. Thus the war in heaven becomes the war on earth. The battlefield shifts from the courts of glory to the streets of cities, to the wilderness where the faithful hide, to the hearts of those who must choose between the mark of the beast and the seal of God. Michael's role does not end with the casting down. He becomes a defender of the church, just as once he was a defender of Israel. The Apocalypse speaks of a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She cries out in labor, about to give birth. The dragon stands before her, ready to devour her child the moment he is born. Yet the child is caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman flees into the wilderness, where a place has been prepared for her. Tradition sees in this image both the Virgin Mary and the Church, and Michael is never far from either. In the visions of the mystics, he is the one who shields the woman's path, striking down the spirits sent to hunt her, turning the desert into a fortress. The saints have long seen in these passages a reflection of every age of persecution. When the Roman arenas ran red with the blood of martyrs, when hidden chapels and catacombs echoed with the whispered hymns of the faithful, they believed Michael was there, unseen but present. His defense was not always to spare the body. Often it was to preserve the soul, to keep the faithful from yielding to the fear that would steal their crown. In the visions of later Christian mystics, Hildegard of Bingen, Bridget of Sweden, and countless unnamed others, Michael appears as a pillar of flame at the church's side, his sword raised not in threat to the faithful, but in warning to the enemy. His very presence is a reminder that the war is not between equals. The dragon may rage, but he is a creature still, bound by the limits of the creation he has twisted. John's vision moves toward the great culmination. The beast and the false prophet deceiving the nations, gathering them for the final battle. The kings of the earth drawn into the valley where the Almighty will bring his judgment. Though the text does not name Michael in these later chapters, tradition holds that the rider on the white horse, faithful and true, commands the armies of heaven, and Michael rides at his side. In that last charge, the sword that once barred the way to the tree of life will strike to open a way again, for the curse will be undone. The war in heaven, the war on earth. These are not two battles, but one fought across the fabric of time and space. Michael has stood in both arenas, unchanging in his allegiance, unshaken by the ages. His name still carries a question that broke the pride of Lucifer. Who is like God? And in the last day, when the enemy is bound and the new Jerusalem descends, that question will no longer be a challenge. It will be the song of the redeemed. History, as men tell it, is measured in empires and crowns, in victories carved into stone and defeats buried beneath the dust of ruined cities. But there is another history, older, deeper, written not in marble or ink, but in the light and shadow that move through the ages. In that history, Michael's name is not an occasional entry. It is a constant refrain. From a first rebellion to the final judgment, he has stood where the line between life and death, between light and darkness, is drawn. He is a sentinel who does not sleep, the prince who stands for the people of God. It is said in the oldest traditions that the angels are outside of time as men know it. They do not age, they do not tire, and they do not forget. What Michael saw when Lucifer's pride cracked the harmony of heaven is as fresh in his mind now as on that first day. What he heard in the promise given to the woman in Eden still shapes the way he watches the world. To him, the victories and losses of millennia are one campaign, long, costly, but certain in its end. And yet Michael's watch is not detached. His is not the cold vigilance of a statue standing guard over a sealed gate. He sees and he acts, and he feels the weight of each soul that clings to covenant, each heart that refuses to lie. The prayers of the faithful are not noise in the courts of heaven. They are the very signals by which he moves. When a mother prays for her child in the deep hours of night, when a man whispers repentance after years of silence, Michael is there, not to replace their will, but to clear the way for it to reach the throne. In the visions granted to the saints across centuries, Michael appears again and again, not as a relic of a distant age, but as a living protector. Some have seen him standing on the ramparts of cities under siege, his sword drawn against armies both visible and invisible. Others have seen him kneeling beside the dying, not to lift them back into the world, but to carry them safely through the passage no enemy can block when the sentinel walks beside them. The mystics speak of a fire in his eyes that is not anger but purity, an unflinching reflection of the holiness he serves. To look into those eyes, they say, is to remember who you are. Dust, yes, but dust chosen and loved, dust meant for glory. In his presence, fear loses its voice. Even now, the war has not ended. The casting down of the dragon in John's vision is both an accomplished victory and an unfolding one. The enemy's final defeat awaits the hour appointed by the Lord, and until that hour, the struggle continues. Not in the open skies of heaven, but in the marketplaces, the courts, the homes, and the hidden corners of the human heart. Here Michael's sword finds its work as much in quiet resistance as in open battle. Sometimes it is a whispered word of courage to one who stands alone. Sometimes it is a barrier placed between a child and the snare laid for him. Sometimes it is a sudden collapse of a plan devised in the shadows. The old question in his name, who is like God, remains a challenge that breaks every mask of pride. In the end, the question is not asked to shame, but to free. For when the heart answers truthfully, no one is like God, it is no longer bound by the need to be its own ruler. That is the freedom Michael fights to preserve. And there will come a day, no man knows the hour, when the watch will end. The sky will open as it did for John, but not to show the enemy's rage. It will open to reveal the king returning, robed in majesty, crowned with many crowns. On that day, Michael will not stand alone. The armies of heaven will ride with him, and the war that began before the earth's foundations will find its last field. The prophets saw shadows of this day. They spoke of a city that needs no sun, for the glory of God gives it light, and its gates will never be shut. In that city, there will be no place for the serpent, no place for the lie, no place for the fear that once stalked the children of men. Michael's sword will be sheathed, not in surrender, but in completion. His vigil will give way to rest, his post to celebration. Until then, he walks the edge of every battle. He stands at the gates of homes where prayers are spoken in desperation. He moves through the alleys where forgotten live and die. He kneels beside the sickbed, the prison wall, the battlefield trench. The sentinel does not choose his ground. He takes the ground he is given, and he holds it. And now, you who have followed his story to the ancient pages in the long centuries, know this. The chronicles of Michael are not over. They are still being written. In your life, in your choices, in the moments when you stand for what is right though it costs you, in the nights when you pray though you see no sign of an answer. Every act of faith is a field he guards. Every act of courage a banner he rallies to. When you refuse the easy lie, when you choose the harder path for the sake of truth, you are standing under the same banner that flew in the first war in heaven. And the sentinel is there, as he has always been, as he will be until the king comes. So remember the name that is a question and a victory all at once. Michael, who is like God? Let it be the question that shapes your days, the challenge that humbles your pride, the cry that strengthens your heart. If this chronicle has stirred you, if it has lifted your eyes to the greater story unfolding beyond the horizon of our days, then take this moment. Subscribe to the Sacred Chronicle. Share this with those who need to be reminded that the war is real and the victory is sure. Let the voice of these stories reach farther, so that when the sentinel stands, he does not stand unaccompanied, but surrounded by a people who know who they are and who they serve. The watch continues, the battle endures, and the eternal sentinel still stands.